You know how in school some kids just seem to, well, effortlessly navigate the social scene while others, maybe not so much.
Mm.
Or like when a classmate is struggling, sometimes you're the first one jumping in to help, and other times you might feel a bit distant.
Yeah, totally. We've all seen that.
Well, today we're taking a deep dive into a really fascinating 1993 study by Jana Juvonen and Bernard Wiener. It's called An Attributional Analysis of Students' Interactions, the Social Consequences of Perceived Responsibility.
It sounds complex, but it's basically like unlocking the hidden code behind those everyday school social interactions.
Exactly. And what's really interesting about it is the framework they use, attribution theory.
Right? Think of attribution theory as our internal detective work. We're constantly trying to figure out the why behind people's actions, especially, other people's actions.
And these whys we come up with, these explanations, they have a surprisingly strong influence on how we feel and then what we do next.
It's huge. The core idea here really is that understanding the social dynamics in schools kind of boils down to how students figure out who's responsible for different behaviors and situations.
Mm-hmm. Like, did a classmate act a certain way because they chose to, or was it something beyond their control?
Exactly. And this perception of controllable versus uncontrollable causes that really stirs up different emotions, right? Like anger or sympathy.
Yeah, and those emotions then guide our social behaviors. Everything from actively rejecting someone to maybe just ignoring them to actually stepping in to help. It covers the whole range.
And this isn't just a quick look. We're going to explore how these judgments of responsibility contribute to why some students are disliked by their peers.
And also what motivates students to help each other or maybe not help each other.
Yeah, and even the clever ways kids try to manage how others see them, like making excuses or trying to get approval. You might find some of this stuff surprisingly familiar.
Definitely. Okay, so let's start with that first big question. Why are some children disliked? Our first thought might go to, the obvious things. Aggression, maybe extreme shyness, even physical differences.
Sure, you see a kid being aggressive and you think, well, that explains why they're not popular. It's a natural first observation. We see the behavior and connect it to the social outcome.
But what this study points out is the deeper layer. It's the reasons we attribute to those characteristics that are really crucial.
Right. It's not just what a kid does, but why their peers think they're doing it. That's what fuels the dislike.
So let's take aggression again. When an unpopular student's aggressive actions are seen as something they're responsible for, classmates think it's intentional meanness that tends to spark anger and dislike.
And that dislike can lead straight to active rejection. Nobody really wants to hang around someone they believe is deliberately causing trouble.
Right. Makes sense.
So the perception of control is absolutely key here. If the behavior is seen as voluntary, something the kid chose, it's much more likely to bring out those negative feelings in others.
Okay, but what about the flip side? What if the trait or situation is seen as uncontrollable? Like, say, a classmate has a disability.
Well, in that case, it's more likely to generate sympathy. People feel sorry for them, understand it's not their fault.
Which you'd think would automatically lead to positive interactions, right? Like more help, more inclusion.
Well, yes and no. The study points out something really interesting here. While sympathy might lead to help, maybe someone offers assistance to that student, it doesn't always translate into real social inclusion.
Huh. So sympathy doesn't equal friendship.
Not necessarily. Sometimes it can even lead to neglect. The student is sort of pitied but not really brought into the fold, not included in social activities. It's a bit surprising, isn't it?
It is. So sympathy motivates helping, maybe, but it doesn't automatically bridge that gap to genuine acceptance.
Exactly. There might be other things going on. Maybe discomfort, maybe just not knowing how to interact easily that prevent that full integration.
And the research by Juvonen from the early 90s really dug into this. They found sixth graders tended to see classmates with antisocial behaviors as being responsible for those actions.
But they didn't hold shy or disabled peers responsible in the same way for their characteristics.
And this difference in perceived responsibility directly impacted their feelings.
Directly. More perceived responsibility led to more anger and less sympathy. Pretty clear link.
And those emotions, the anger and sympathy, they then predicted how the kids behave socially.
Absolutely. Anger was linked to more rejection and less willingness to help, while sympathy, as you'd expect, predicted a greater likelihood of offering support.
What's really compelling, though, is that Juvonen even did an experimental manipulation study.
Yeah, in '92. They basically presented scenarios where the reason behind a characteristic like arrogance or obesity or shyness was framed differently, sometimes as controllable, sometimes as uncontrollable.
And what happened?
They found that perceived responsibility had its own independent effect on how much the kids liked the person and how willing they were to help, even when they statistically accounted for how annoying the characteristic itself might be.
Wow. So it wasn't just about whether the trait was bothersome. It was really about whether they thought the person was in control of it.
Exactly. That kind of experimental evidence is really powerful because it helps isolate the specific role of perceived responsibility. It confirms it's a significant shaper of our social responses.
And it sounds like this can create a real downward spiral with unpopularity. Like once a kid is disliked, their actions get viewed through this negative lens,
Often interpreted as intentional.
which then just reinforces those negative reactions and expectations from others. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Absolutely. Negative reputations can be incredibly sticky. Once they're established, they can totally bias how others interpret even ambiguous behavior. It makes it really, really difficult for that unpopular student to break free.
Yeah, like every little misstep, even if it was totally accidental, just gets seen as more proof.
Exactly. More proof of their bad character.
Okay, now, it's not just about how the popular kids are judging the less popular ones. The study also flips the perspective, right? It looks at how unpopular children themselves perceive their peers.
That's right. They're not just passive recipients of all this negative treatment. They have their own interpretations, too.
And one key idea here is something called hostile attribution bias. Can you unpack that a bit?
Sure. Hostile attribution bias is basically the tendency, often seen in kids who are aggressive or frequently rejected, to assume that when something negative or ambiguous happens in a social situation, it was done on purpose, maliciously.
Even if there's no clear evidence.
Even if it's totally unclear. So if someone bumps into them in the hallway or spills their drink accidentally, their immediate thought is more likely to be, they did that to me, on purpose.
And that leads to
Anger, aggression, reacting defensively when maybe it wasn't necessary at all.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're already feeling like an outsider, maybe you're more on edge, more likely to see negative intent everywhere.
Exactly. And research by Dodge, Waz, and others really supports this idea. It shows how these negative social experiences can actually shape a child's basic interpretation of social cues, even neutral ones.
Is it just aggressive kids?
Well, primarily associated with aggressive and rejected kids, but some research hinted that maybe neglected girls might show similar patterns sometimes too. It's complex.
And it's not just these automatic interpretations, right? The study also touches on how kids who are aggressive might just have different values or expectations.
Yeah, that's another layer. For instance, they might not place as much importance on the suffering of someone they've hurt, or maybe they don't care as much about their own social standing within the group.
So the consequences just don't register as strongly for them.
Potentially. If you don't highly value positive relationships, or you don't really feel the impact of your negative actions on others, you're probably less motivated to change your behavior, even if you know others disapprove.
But there's a really encouraging point in the study, too. It mentions an intervention. Graham, Hudley, and Williams. They actually tried to tackle this hostile attribution bias.
Yes, this was a really insightful study back in '92. They used things like role-playing, group discussions, even watching and analyzing video scenarios
Do what exactly?
to help these aggressive boys learn to more accurately assess responsibility in different social situations. Basically, to help them tell the difference between actions that were accidental, actions that were ambiguous, and actions that were genuinely, intentionally hostile.
And did it work?
It actually did. The boys who got this attribution retraining showed a significant decrease in how often they jumped to conclusions about negative intent. They reported feeling less anger, and crucially, they showed fewer aggressive responses themselves.
Wow. And did it last?
Yeah, the positive changes even held up when researchers followed up later and observed their actual social interactions. It's a pretty powerful stuff.
It really is. It shows that these ways of thinking, these biases, they aren't necessarily set in stone. You can change them.
By directly addressing how these kids interpret social cues and assign responsibility, it's possible to shift their emotions and ultimately their behavior. It suggests that understanding these cognitive processes can really lead to effective interventions.
That's genuinely hopeful. And it ties into another interesting finding mentioned from Rebner and Coy about the power of expectations.
Oh yeah, that one's fascinating too. They found that if rejected boys were simply told that unfamiliar peers actually like them.
Even if it wasn't necessarily true.
Right, just manipulating their expectation. They ended up having much better, more positive social interactions with those peers later on.
So just thinking someone likes you can make you act in a way that makes them actually like you more.
It seems so. It really highlights how much our expectations shape things. If a rejected kid goes into a new situation expecting positivity, they might approach it differently. More confidence, more openness, which in turn can elicit better responses from others. It's another potential way to break that negative cycle.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the negative side, rejection, aggression, bias, but the study also delves into the more positive side, specifically help giving in the classroom.
Absolutely. And maybe unsurprisingly at this point, attribution theory plays a big role here too. It's not just about avoiding bad interactions. Our perceptions of responsibility also influence our willingness to offer support.
Like Wiener's own classic study, the note-lending one.
Exactly. Remember that. College students were asked if they'd lend class notes to someone who missed class.
Right, and they were much more willing to lend notes if the person missed class for an uncontrollable reason, like an eye problem, compared to someone who missed it for a controllable reason, like just deciding to go to the beach instead.
That study just perfectly illustrates the chain. Perceived reason leads to emotion, leads to behavior. The uncontrollable eye problem led to sympathy, which increased helping. The controllable beach trip, well, probably less sympathy, maybe even annoyance.
Leading to less willingness to help out makes total sense.
Yeah. And the study points out that tons of other research has backed this up. Sympathy, and sometimes it's opposite, maybe anger or resentment, acts as that emotional bridge between how controllable we think a situation is and whether we decide to lend a hand.
It seems like a really consistent pattern then. If we think someone's difficulties are beyond their control, we feel sympathy, we're motivated to help.
But if we believe they're largely responsible for their own mess, we might feel less inclined, yet maybe even a bit put out if we think they could have avoided it.
And this applies to teachers too.
Oh, definitely. Research by Brophy and Warkemper showed teachers were more likely to offer extra support and show more patience with students whose problems seemed uncontrollable. Think low self-esteem or shyness.
Compared to
students whose problems were seen as controllable, like being disruptive, not trying, acting out, teachers might feel more frustration or anger in those cases.
That makes intuitive sense. Teachers want to help kids overcome genuine challenges, but maybe less so if they think the kid is just choosing not to try or choosing to cause trouble.
Right. The attribution makes a difference in their emotional response and their willingness to extend that extra help.
And this has knock-on effects for things like group work too, right? Cooperative learning.
For sure. Imagine a group project. If one student is struggling because they genuinely don't understand the material that feels uncontrollable, low ability of the affirmation, maybe their group mates are probably more likely to pitch in and help them figure it out.
But if the group thinks that student is just slacking off, being lazy.
Yeah, if it's perceived as controllable lack of effort, that help might not be so readily available. There might be resentment instead.
So perceived effort and responsibility within a group can really impact how supportive members are of each other.
Definitely. It highlights how important it is to create a classroom vibe where kids feel safe admitting they don't get something without worrying they'll just be judged as lazy.
Okay, so we've seen how our perceptions of responsibility influence how we react to others. But the study also explores the flip side. How do students actively try to influence how others react to them?
Ah, yes, impression management. This is where students get strategic.
Trying to shape how teachers and classmates see them.
Exactly. Often by trying to influence the attributions others make for their actions, both when things go wrong and, interestingly, when things go right.
Let's start with the classic. Excuses. We've all used them. Showing up late, not finishing homework. Kids learn pretty quickly that these things can make teachers mad or friends disappointed.
And what's the main goal of an excuse? It's usually to reduce or completely deny your responsibility, right?
Yeah, shift the blame, minimize your role in whatever went wrong.
And, just like how we judge others, the perceived controllability of the excuse is critical for how well it works.
So an excuse pointing to something uncontrollable. My alarm didn't go off, my mom didn't wake me up, the bus was late.
Is generally much more effective at deflecting anger than one citing a controllable cause like, I just didn't feel like getting up, or I decided to finish my video game.
Why is
Because the uncontrollable excuse suggests it wasn't really the student's fault, or at least not a conscious choice. It softens the negative judgment and the anger that comes with it.
It's almost like kids figure this out instinctively. The study mentions research by Weiner and Handel finding that even really young kids, like 5 to 7 years old,
Hmm.
understand that controllable reasons for breaking a promise or rule make people angrier. And so they're more likely to hide those controllable reasons or offer a different excuse.
Pretty remarkable, isn't it? It suggests kids grasp this responsibility emotion link very early on and start using it strategically in their interactions.
And it's not just kids. Another study mentioned found college students who gave an uncontrollable excuse for being late were viewed much more positively than those giving a controllable excuse, or, interestingly, no excuse at all.
Right. Having some explanation, especially an uncontrollable one, is better than just letting people assume the worst, which might be that you just didn't care. It's a fundamental part of managing social friction.
Okay, so that's avoiding negative reactions. But students are also motivated to seek positive reactions, right? Social approval.
Hugely motivated. But the strategies they use here can be really subtle, and, crucially, they often depend on the audience. Who are they trying to impress? Teachers, parents, or their peers?
Because what works with one group might totally backfire with another.
Exactly. Students are often juggling these different social expectations all the time.
So take failing an exam. That Juvonen and Murdoch research from '93, it found that teenagers were more likely to deny responsibility for failing when talking to teachers and parents.
Probably to avoid punishment or disappointment.
Oh, phew.
It wasn't my fault the test was unfair, or something like that.
But when talking to their peers about the same failure,
They were often more willing to just admit they didn't study.
huh, why the difference? Why admit lack of effort to friends?
Well, it can serve a few social functions within the peer group. Sometimes it signals a kind of cool nonconformity. I don't care that much about school.
Right. Being too much of a tryhard isn't always cool with peers.
Exactly. And it could also be a way to save face. Think about it. Failing, even though you tried really hard, might imply you lack ability. But failing because you didn't bother studying.
It preserves the idea that you could have done well if you'd wanted to. It protects your image of competence in a way.
Precisely.
And
It's like saying, yeah, I bombed it, but whatever, I didn't even study. It maintains a certain status.
Okay, but what about with parents and teachers again? The study says students reported being more willing to attribute failure to a lack of ability when talking to them. That seems totally counterintuitive for making a good impression.
It does on the surface. Why admit you're not smart enough?
Yeah.
But the attributional perspective gives us an insight. Remember, attributions influence emotions. Attributing failure to an uncontrollable cause like perceived low ability. What emotion might that elicit in an adult?
Sympathy. Maybe understanding.
Exactly. So instead of facing anger or punishment for perceived lack of effort, the student might get sympathy, support, maybe offers of extra help. It's a different kind of social maneuvering aimed at a different emotional response.
Wow. That's really subtle, using different attributions to strategically manage the emotional reactions of different audiences.
It really is. And when it comes to success, the opposite often applies with adults. The study notes that taking responsibility, attributing success to controllable factors like hard work and effort.
That usually maximizes praise and approval from teachers and parents, right?
Generally, yes. In academic settings, effort is highly valued. Showing you worked hard for your success is usually seen as very positive.
But again, the peer dynamic throws a wrench in the works.
It can. Openly boasting about how much you studied to ace a test might be seen as overly competitive, maybe even showing off by your peers. It could violate those unspoken rules about group equality or not making others feel bad.
So kids have to be careful. Can't brag too much about effort to friends.
Exactly. They're often very aware of these implicit peer norms. What earns praise from adults might earn eye rolls from peers. They have to navigate that carefully.
And the study raises a really important caution about the potential long-term effects of some of these tactics. Like if a student constantly claims they didn't study, even when they secretly did.
They might actually start to internalize that value. They might actually start studying less over time.
It could become a self-defeating prophecy. The image they project starts to become reality.
That's a crucial consideration.
Yeah.
These self-presentation strategies might work for short-term social goals, getting approval, avoiding hassle, but they could potentially undermine actual academic engagement and achievement in the long run.
So wrapping this all up, this deep dive into Juvonen and Wiener's work really shows just how powerful our perceptions of responsibility are. They shape so much of the social world in school.
It gives us a framework for understanding stuff that seems really complex, why some kids are rejected, why others help out, even the strategic games kids play to manage their image.
And what's so useful is how this attributional lens connects the dots, right? It shows how our interpretations, controllable versus uncontrollable, drive our emotions, and then our emotions drive our actions towards others.
It's a really clear and insightful model.
And this isn't just, abstract academic stuff. Whether you're currently a student or a parent or just someone interested in how people tick, recognizing these underlying motivations gives you really valuable insight into the social lives of young people.
Yeah, it might even make you think about your own interactions a bit differently.
Definitely.
Which brings up a final thought, maybe, for everyone listening. Start noticing the attributions you make. When something happens socially, big or small, what's your go-to explanation for why someone acted that way?
And how might consciously shifting those perspectives, maybe considering alternative, maybe less controllable reasons, change how you feel and react?
Exactly. Could it lead to more positive, more supportive interactions? Not just in school, but, everywhere. And also, think about those self-presentation strategies we talked about. What are the long-term effects of the ways we and others manage impressions?
Lots to think about. This deep dive gives us the framework.
The ongoing exploration, applying it, that's really up to all of us.